Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Last time, we left the colony of Virginia in dire straits. Somewhere in the realm of 400 people had died either from starvation or from attack by the neighboring Powhatan Confederacy. John Smith was injured, and he abandoned Jamestown to what they called the starving time, a time during which the people of Virginia turned to cannibalism to survive. We're not going to revisit my feelings about John Smith, but they aren't good. The Virginia Company appears to have agreed. They appointed a man named Thomas West, the Baron de la Warre, as governor for life of the Virginia Company. Now, the de la Warre family was involved in the foundation of Delaware, but we'll talk about that when we get to New England. We'll be calling the Baron de la Warre, and later his sons, the Lords Delaware. That's how they are better known to history. There are quite a few names that we're going to be introducing this week, and they can get confusing, so I'm going to make a note of those that you really need to remember. You don't need to remember the names of most of the people in this story. For example, the acting governor of Jamestown after John Smith left, well, he was killed in a Powhatan raid in 1609. You don't need to remember his name. He was dead. But his death was consequential. It kicked off the First Anglo-Powhatan War. You also don't need to remember the name of the minor nobleman who succeeded him as governor. He was one of those that, during the starving time, was permitted a ration of food due to his absolutely integral duties of paper signing and delegating work. He's one of those that survived the starving time, and I do wonder if he, in fact, delegated the duties of killing and butchering that teenage girl. It's clear I don't think much of the men who led Jamestown in her early days, but I should cut them a little bit of slack. Getting word back to England was easy, but getting supplies to America was not at the time. And on that note, we actually should remember the name of Samuel Argall. He was a sailor who pioneered the northern sea route across the Atlantic. It was Argall that commanded the voyage that found Jamestown there on the brink of total destruction. Samuel Argall took command of the Jamestown colony and command of the forces he brought with him. He prosecuted the war against the Powhatan people and did well. He held the fort, literally, against the Powhatan, until, a few months later, Lord Delaware arrived with a small army. Delaware pushed the Powhatan back and really saved Jamestown for the English, but after some time he had to return to England. It was another acting governor, another name you don't need to remember, that captured the Princess Pocahontas. That's a story in and of itself, but apparently Pocahontas was treated well, according to her station, as a princess. That English governor negotiated a prisoner transfer, and Pocahontas was returned to her people, but eventually she was married off to an English planter, which established a tense peace between the English and the Powhatan people. The Powhatan agreed to allow the English to expand inland, to establish plantations on the mainland. John West, the son of Thomas West and the new Lord Delaware, he built a tobacco plantation on a site that he coined West Point. It's that West Point. All the other men of means that arrived in Virginia began to build tobacco plantations. That's why they wanted to go to Virginia in the first place. Tobacco was really profitable. At times, it was the most profitable commodity produced in North America. Beaver pelts and other parts of the beavers would give them a run for their money from time to time, and of course cotton would overtake it in the future, but for now, tobacco was king. The problem was labor. At first, the English imported Irish rebels to work their fields, but, wouldn't you know it, a bunch of rebellious island dwellers didn't make good servants, and they turned out to be very good at escaping and stealing ships. So to prevent any further piracy, the English decided to import convicted pirates. That lasted about 10 minutes and very nearly set off another Anglo-Spanish war. Those English pirates kept stealing ships and running off to Tortuga or Abraham's Key and sailing with the buccaneers. But that left the English with the same problem: labor. Which brings us to perhaps the most consequential act of piracy in American history. This is episode 154, Grievous Crimes of Piracy and Murder. The meat of today's show is not about this most consequential act of piracy. We'll be talking about the most notorious act of piracy in early Virginia. But here, to begin with, I want to look at one particular ship's capture. A group of English pirates off the coast of Africa captured a Portuguese slave ship. They traveled to the West Indies, but they were chased off by Spanish naval vessels and landed in Virginia. Now, slavery wasn't yet legal in English territories, and they also had another provision against enslaving anyone who was a Christian. The Portuguese knew this, and thus they baptized all of those they captured as slaves. That made it doubly illegal for the English to enslave these men that they had captured. Instead, they were sold into indentured servitude. This was the dawn of the African slave trade in North America. As we all know, that will become one of the great horrors of human history. But there's not much to talk about when it comes to that particular act of piracy. What we usually have to go on in pirate stories are testimonies and affidavits, legal proceedings that people wrote down. But no one was keen to arrest or prosecute any of these pirates who had been involved in such a mutually profitable crime. They were paid and went about their merry way. The act of piracy that we're going to concentrate on today instead requires us to return to London, as well as the religious tensions that were about to tear England apart. Do you remember Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth's older sister, known as Bloody Mary? Queen Mary was a devout Catholic. She married the King of Spain and tied England to Habsburg Catholic Europe. That alliance between England and Spain was facilitated by, among others, a family in England that was prominent and Catholic, the Calvert family. Now, the Calverts had a palace in a city called Richmond. Richmond is today a suburb of London, but at the time it was a separate entity. Richmond was also the home of the royal palace of the Tudors, Richmond Palace, and it was just down the street from the Calvert residence. Mary was very happy to live down the street from the Calverts, but Elizabeth, as it turned out, wasn't terribly fond of her neighbors who had facilitated the marriage between her sister and the King of Spain, her Catholic neighbors who were attempting to entice Elizabeth into that very same proposal. Eventually, the Calvert family left Richmond. They continued to own their property, but they went to their estates up north in Yorkshire. However, Elizabeth's policies of religious uniformity followed them even into the English countryside. The Calvert family adhered to these policies. They attended English Mass, but reports were filtering back to London about the reality of their religious beliefs. Reportedly, they had a priest that lived on their estate who held Mass for the Calvert family and who taught their son George. They taught him all about the doctrine of the Catholic Church and raised George to be a devout young Catholic. Upon reaching adulthood, George Calvert moved back to their palace at Richmond. To quote one Protestant, George Calvert turned Richmond, quote, evil with religion, end quote. That is to say, he made it a place of Catholic acceptance. George Calvert served as kind of an unofficial envoy of Catholic English aristocracy to the courts of mainland Europe, the Habsburgs and Bourbon courts, which is why Sir Robert Cecil approached George Calvert to facilitate the transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts on the continent. He was to approach their courts and tell them that while this new Stuart king was going to be a Protestant, he was going to be a lot cooler about the whole Catholic thing. Robert Cecil was George Calvert's patron at court, and that was a relationship that led to Calvert's position on the Privy Council and then to see George Calvert succeed Robert Cecil as the Secretary of State. That's the reason that George Calvert named his eldest son Cecil. Cecil Calvert was close to the woman who would go on to be the Queen of England, Princess Henrietta Maria. The Calvert family actually played a role in her marriage to the Prince Charles. When the Stuarts announced their intention to marry the prince to a French Catholic princess, the Parliament balked at the suggestion, but the Calvert family suggested an alternative. They suggested a Spanish Catholic princess. The Parliament saw the lesser of two evils in the French Princess Henrietta Maria. For all of the services that the Calverts had rendered to the crown, King James I raised George Calvert as the first Baron Baltimore. George Calvert's role in this story is over. Shortly after being raised to the rank of Baron, he passed away. But his son took up his title and all his duties. Henceforth, we're going to refer to him strictly as Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore had a vision for a Catholic colony in America, a colony that could serve as a refuge for Catholics from England should the politics of the day turn against them, as it had in the past. It was also a place that could serve as an economic and potentially a military base for English Catholics. And I actually agree with this move. I think it was the right move. That might surprise you. I've been accused of having an anti-Catholic bias, but I don't. I do have an anti-monarchist bias, an anti-religious persecution bias, and during this period, especially on the continent, monarchism and religious persecution went hand in hand with the Catholic centers of power. But in England, the tables were turned. The Protestant Anglicans held all the power. The Catholics, who under Queen Mary had dished out their fair share of religious persecution, went on to endure their own religious persecution. Queen Elizabeth demanded the oath of allegiance and supremacy to the English Church. That was an oath required of all public officials and nobility in England, swearing not to undermine the English Church. It sounds draconian, and it was draconian, but much like the Edict of Nantes, it did give a modicum of freedom to the religious minority. But any freedoms given to you by a monarch can be just as easily swept away. It would be unfair, even maybe dishonest, to compare English Catholics to the Sephardi Jews in Spain, but much like those persecuted peoples who fled Spain and established a colony in Jamaica, I think it's a smart move for the English Catholics to flee England and create a Catholic colony in America. You need a backup plan, and this was theirs. Baron Baltimore planned to name his new colony after his friend and his queen, Henrietta Maria. He was going to name it Maryland. But there are, of course, other insinuations in the name of Maryland. There's the former queen, Mary. They called her Bloody Mary because of her persecution of English Protestants. Then, of course, there is Mary, the Mother of God, who is a powerful symbol in the Catholic Church and something of a lightning rod to Protestants, especially at the time. None of this sounded good to Lord Delaware in Virginia. Not only was this a Catholic colony on Virginia's doorstep, it was a Catholic colony in lands that, according to the Virginia Company Charter, belonged to him. And take a look at the symbolism here. Virginia was named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, a queen who was a hero to the Protestants in England and a witch to English Catholics. Maryland, on the other hand, was named after, well, take your pick. The Queen of England, a former Queen of England, both of them powerful Catholic women, or perhaps the most prominent Catholic icon in the world. And, to name your colony after the Queen seems perfectly reasonable, an innocent and even patriotic move, but anybody paying attention would have seen what was being said here. And again, I'm not against this. I think that's kind of cool, actually. That's a bold declaration of intent and of allegiance. In the story to come, I do genuinely believe that both sides share the blame. Between 1629 and 1632, both sides fought a lengthy legal battle. There were suits and countersuits and arguments made to king and council and parliament. The Virginia Company argued their claim to the northern reaches of the Chesapeake, but at this point those lands were sitting empty. Well, not empty, of course. There were Algonquin tribes there, but there were no English settlements. Since those lands had been sitting empty of English colonists for almost 40 years now, King Charles I upheld Lord Baltimore's claim and inducted Maryland into the realm. Lord Delaware was angry about the decision, but publicly he respected the king's word. However, this was 1632. King Charles I was a deeply unpopular king. There was a lot of respecting the king's word going around while doing whatever it is you wanted to do. Now, understand that Lords Delaware and Baltimore weren't often in America. Both men were officially governors for life of their respective colonies, but in reality they were palatines. We might see that as similar to a viceroy in the Spanish Empire. They had factors and lawyers and agents there to see their will done, and always they had an acting governor or deputy governor or lieutenant governor running the colony. The details between those titles were typically in the scope of their power, but the job remained essentially the same. Baltimore, Lord Baltimore, had one man to do the job in Maryland, his brother, Leonard Calvert, his younger brother. All of those men we talked about earlier that you don't need to remember served as governor of Virginia at some point. Virginia had a lot of governors under Lord Delaware, and most of them, to our story at least, are relatively inconsequential. The next name that we're going to introduce, though, you do need to pay attention to. Lord Delaware's opening political salvo against Lord Baltimore came from his 4 top agents in Virginia. 3 of those names you don't need to know. One was a governor, one was a future governor, and they were all wealthy planters. But the 4th name, to quote Donald G. Chamette in Pirates of the Chesapeake, quote, was a 34-year-old stockholder in the Virginia Company, a hearty, pugnacious, well-educated man named William Claiborne. Claiborne had been a friend of Captain John Smith in London and secured a 3-year appointment as surveyor to make a map of Virginia. Possessed of courage, industry, and resolve, Claiborne could little guess that he would one day be branded a pirate. Nor could he foresee the turmoil his singular enterprises would inflict upon the political geography of the entire Tidewater region. End quote. William Claiborne and those 3 other, quote, persons of quality and trust, end quote, signed a letter. That letter, written to King Charles, alleged that Lord Baltimore had refused to take the oath of allegiance and supremacy to the Church of England. Regardless, though, nothing came of that accusation, so Lord Delaware chose to take a more direct course of action, and he did so through William Claiborne. Claiborne had some radical leanings. He was an Anglican, a vocally zealous Anglican, but Claiborne was sympathetic toward the Puritan cause. He was a little bit militant in his opposition of the king's conciliatory policies, and the Puritans were at the fore of the militant anti-royal movement. Claiborne proposed a plan to the governor of Virginia. If Maryland's claim on the northern Chesapeake was based in Virginia's lack of settlements there, well, what if Virginia beat the Catholics to that region and established a settlement? Claiborne proposed to build a trading post that would deal in Native American goods. But more than anything, the trade was in furs. Claiborne suggested a large island in the Chesapeake for his trading post, an island that was perilously close to the coast of Maryland. Lord Delaware, the governor of Virginia, and William Claiborne all agreed to work together in this matter. They claimed the island and called it Kent Island. And I'd love to paint this as another symbolic victory, but Claiborne was just from Kent. It wasn't named after Canterbury Cathedral. There was no symbolic blow made, at least not that I can see. But there was a very real, tangible, strategic victory. Claiborne was building a trading post on an island. That meant that they would have to build docks and shipyards and all of the infrastructure needed to facilitate a fleet. Of course, they would be home to only merchant ships, but those merchant ships would have to be armed. There were threats out there, after all. Thus began a race in 1632, just after Maryland was inducted into the realm. There was Claiborne and Delaware on the one side against Baltimore and Calvert on the other. Claiborne traveled to London. He secured a royal patent for the trading post on Kent Island, and he secured investors. With their money, he bought supplies and ships, and managed to recruit men for his venture, and then he sailed back to America to build his settlement. Now, the ground had already been broken, but now that it was all official, construction could begin in real earnest. When the very first colonists bound for Maryland arrived, Kent Island, just off their coast, already had a dock and a mill and a church and houses and gardens and orchards and a cattle yard. There were hundreds of people living on Kent Island, just off the coast of their land. By the time Leonard Calvert arrived at their settlement at St. Mary's, Kent Island was firmly ensconced. Lord Baltimore and his brother Calvert were furious. However, Kent Island had all of the proper licenses and forms. They were fully legal and accredited. They couldn't just kick Claiborne out. So what followed here was this oddly polite battle of words. A letter from Lord Baltimore to his brother said that he was, quote, willing to give all the support to Claiborne he can to proceed, end quote. Claiborne's fur trading operation was profitable, and clearly he had the drive to succeed. However, William Claiborne was Virginia's Secretary of State. Kent Island was represented in the Council of Virginia. They made it very clear that Kent Island, just off the coast of Maryland, belonged to Virginia. Lord Baltimore made it clear that William Claiborne would be allowed to keep Kent Island, that he could enjoy all of the profits that she offered, but Baltimore required that Kent Island seek representation not in the Council of Virginia, but in Maryland, which was difficult. Aside from his trading post on Kent Island, Claiborne had large tracts of land that were currently being worked in tobacco production. He was a resident of Jamestown as well as Kent Island and the Secretary of State. Well, it wasn't going to fly. Once again, the lawsuits and the official requests and the cutting words flew around London. Those appeals once again reached the desk of Charles I, but Donald Chaumette writes, quote, "The unwillingness of the king and council to rule directly on the matter would, in a very short time, lead to charges of piracy, bloodshed, and the first naval engagement between English-speaking people in the New World." End quote. This war of words, though, continued on peaceably for well over a year. Everyone here was making money. They didn't want to put a stop to that. But things took a turn for the worse there in Maryland. The Algonquin people on the mainland that lived nearby were not part of the Powhatan Confederation. They were a people called the Patuxent people, and they were initially friendly to Maryland. But in the summer of 1634, the Patuxent began to grow suspicious of the Marylanders. They grew hostile toward them. One Jesuit priest, Father Andrew White, noted the suspicious nature of these tidings. He wrote, quote, "At this time Captain Claiborne was there, from whom we understood the Indians were all in arms to resist us, having heard that 60 Spanish ships were coming to destroy them. The rumor was most likely to have begun from himself." End quote. Father Andrew is saying here that he believed William Claiborne planted this fear in the Patuxent people. It kind of makes sense. Claiborne had a lot of dealings with the Patuxent through his fur trade business. And Father Andrew wasn't alone in that belief. In 1634, a resident of Jamestown of Virginia, a fur trader named Henry Fleet, came forward with accusations that William Claiborne was doing exactly what that priest believed. Lord Calvert was furious. He demanded that action be taken, and right here, in the summer of 1634, we need to look very carefully at the timing of everything that's to come. Henry Fleet made his accusation in early June 1634. Immediately, William Claiborne was arrested and sent to jail in Jamestown, Virginia, not Maryland. As soon as Claiborne was arrested, Calvert sent a letter off to his brother, Lord Baltimore, to inform him of these treacheries. On the 20th of June, a couple of weeks later, on the banks of the Patuxent River, a group of people met. There were Patuxent elders, and there were councilmen and commissioners from Virginia and Maryland. There was Father Andrew, and then Henry Fleet and William Claiborne. This wasn't a trial, but it was an investigation. They wanted to get to the bottom of what had happened here. The questioning, once they actually asked those Patuxent elders what had happened, didn't take very long. It revealed that William Claiborne had not, in fact, told any falsehoods. He had not spread any of that fear to the Patuxent people. Someone had, though. Henry Fleet, the man who came forward with that accusation, was jealous of Kent Island. He was a fur trader, and Kent Island was taking most of his business. He heard the rumors of Claiborne's involvement and tried to capitalize on them. Henry Fleet was arrested, and Claiborne was totally exonerated. Within a week, another flurry of letters sailed off to inform everyone, from Lords Baltimore and Delaware to the Virginia Company and the company that invested in Kent Island, Claiborne and Sons, and even the king and the council. Everyone in England was informed of the results. Everything appeared to have been cleared up. Everything appeared to be smooth sailing. However, those letters, well, it took time for them to reach England. The first letter that informed Lord Baltimore of the arrest arrived first. Baltimore was naturally furious at this. He sent orders back to America that if William Claiborne continued operating, he should be arrested and sent to a jail in Maryland. Kent Island would be seized. If they had to, they would blockade all of her harbors. Lord Baltimore shot those letters back to America on his very fastest ships, and he sent supplies and guns and men. He was making war here. He did all of this amazingly quickly, almost suspiciously quickly, as though he may have had some prior warning of what was to come. On the 22nd of July, in response to that same bit of news, the Lords of Trade and Plantations and the King both penned 2 pairs of letters. Those letters ordered everyone in Virginia and Maryland to just relax, to chill out here. No one is to fight over this. No one is to be executed, unless, of course, the king ordered it, because, after all, everybody here was English. Everybody was working toward a common goal. Plus, the French have this monopoly on the fur market, so let's not work at tearing down the most successful fur trader in America. Everybody put down your pitchforks and learn to work together. A few days later, in a very short time after those letters left England, the letters that informed everyone about the trial and the exoneration reached England. Baltimore, Delaware, the Virginia Company, Claiborne Company, the Lords of Trade, the King, everyone now knew that those charges had been trumped up. They had to do everything they could to stop anything untoward from happening. And to their credit, they tried, even though he didn't try terribly hard, Lord Baltimore. But by the time their attempts to stop whatever was coming reached America, it was too late. By the time their orders to lay down their arms arrived to their underlings, blood had already been spilled. Men had been killed, and honor had been insulted. When we left off, the situation on Chesapeake Bay was on edge. One man, William Claiborne, stood at the heart of all the turmoil. Claiborne was a Virginia fur trader who also owned large tobacco plantations and served as the Secretary of State for Virginia. The conflict on the Chesapeake was due to his trading post on Kent Island. Kent Island should, obviously, have been considered part of the Maryland colony, at least geographically speaking. But that's assuming a few things. There are border considerations and territorial allocations and the rights of the inhabitants and the owners of the island. One does need to take all that into account, and it all did play a role here. But more than any other factor, there was one key question. Should the Maryland colony exist at all? The government of Virginia, including William Claiborne and the governor, Thomas West, the 3rd Baron Delaware, did not think that Maryland should exist. It was technically on land that formerly had belonged to the Virginia Company. However, after sitting unused for 40 years, at least unused by the English, the Crown chose to give Maryland to another party. Which, does make sense. England was trying to build an empire here. If Virginia wasn't going to use the land, give someone else a crack at it. Namely, they gave it to Cecil Calvert, the 2nd Baron Baltimore. Now, Claiborne and Delaware didn't much care for Baltimore or his younger brother, the acting governor of Maryland, Leonard Calvert. Mostly, this was due to the fact that the Calvert family and the Maryland colony under them were Catholic. Virginia was a staunchly, even zealously, Protestant colony. They were officially Anglican, but a few tendrils of Puritan influence were present there as well, and they would grow. Now, the struggle over Kent Island seemed to culminate when William Claiborne was put on trial. He had been falsely accused of turning the nearby Patuxent people against Maryland. But Claiborne was exonerated. He didn't do it. Everybody back in England, upon receipt of that news, sent messages that ordered everyone to stand down and cool out. But by the time they did, it was too late. By the time that word reached America, blood had already been shed. It was the first blood in a conflict that would turn the Chesapeake red, and it would turn Kent Island into a haven for the absolute worst sort of sailors that England had to offer. This is episode 155, Grievous Crimes of Piracy and Murder, Part 2. So what happened in America? Well, when Lord Baltimore's first set of orders came down, the fire and brimstone orders, cease all operations or face my judgment, Claiborne received a letter that told him to cease all operations or action would be taken. Claiborne, though, didn't stop any of his operations. So a number of small ships full of armed men began to circle Kent Island to put them under the threatened blockade. Then a group of warriors from the Susquehannock people, armed with bows and, notably, a few muskets, attacked Kent Island. Mysterious. Although to the people of Kent Island it was as good as a declaration of war against them. Claiborne immediately began construction on 2 forts and produced what was frankly an amazing amount of cannons and small arms from what appeared to be out of thin air. He'd obviously been stockpiling arms and ammunition for years. Now the Catholic ships that were menacing Kent Island attempted to disrupt the fort construction throughout the winter, but Claiborne's defenses stopped them at every turn. When the spring finally arrived, the misunderstanding had been all cleared up. All of those letters from England had reached America telling everybody to relax, but people were dead, and neither camp was willing to back down. In March of 1635, William Claiborne's brother-in-law captured a Maryland pinnace that was threatening landfall on Kent Island. Donald Chimette calls this, quote, the first documented act of piracy on the waters of Chesapeake Bay, end quote, and that's accurate. This seizure was very well documented. The Marylanders made sure of it, and though there had been acts of piracy between English peoples in America already, this was the first on the Chesapeake. However, William Claiborne, once the pinnace was brought back to Kent Island, he didn't take their ship or their cargo. He arrested the crew and he threw them in a holding cell, and then William Claiborne harangued them. He talked to them forcefully, yes, but he made his position clear. Claiborne asserted that Kent Island was his land, and he let them know that his allegiance was, always had been, and always would be, to Virginia. Now they could live as neighbors in peace. That was, after all, the will of the king. Or they could escalate this into a fight. But that wasn't up to William Claiborne. He wanted to continue doing business. That was up to Maryland. And to prove this point, he let them go. William Claiborne released the Maryland pinnace and the men and their goods. However, William Claiborne did make his point. stay the hell away from Kent Island. And that is exactly the opposite of what Maryland did. Now, it sounds to me, personally, very much like William Claiborne's brother-in-law messed up when he captured that pinnace. That was a folly, it was a bad move, a bad look. And now William Claiborne was doing everything in his power to mitigate the fallout of that ship's capture. But, as previously noted, this was very well documented as an act of piracy. In a few short weeks, London was rumbling with this threat of piracy in America. So let's take a second to look at the climate in London and in England as a whole. It's relevant to what's happening in America, but I will be quick. We've talked about this before. The King of England was Charles I, the second Stuart king to sit the throne. Charles was a deeply unpopular king. The state of affairs in England wasn't great anyway. The fumes of Elizabethan prosperity were little more than a memory, and even the cultural highs of his father's reign were rapidly dwindling. The situation deteriorated for Charles I. He had a lot of opposition, and finally, in the 1630s, we have a period known as the personal rule of Charles I. In the face of all that opposition, the king chose not to call a single parliament between 1629 and 1640. Now that was against the law, or at least it was against the will of Magna Carta. Now that was an old document. 300 years later, nobody much cared about that dusty old piece of paper, but once King Charles came round, the Magna Carta became the subject of much aristocratic debate. Now, the immediate effect of governing without a legislative body, the most direct effect, is that the king was unable to collect taxes. Parliament held the purse strings here. Now, Charles did try a few other means to collect money. He attempted to collect what was called ship money, that is, a levy for the king to raise a navy to defend England from invasion by sea. The navy wasn't having any of it, and really that didn't work out too well for King Charles, but there were a few other methods. Charles attempted to impose fines for everyday affairs, basically taxing people for living their life, but these absolutely were not taxes. I told you last time that during this era there was a lot of respecting the king's will while ignoring him going on. Most of that started with these definitely not taxes. If the king had followed Elizabeth's example and just commissioned a fleet of privateers, he would have raked in money. But that upset the Spanish and the Pope, and King Charles wanted to avoid both. Which brings us to the religious question, the defining question of the era. King Charles was not a Catholic. Probably, at least. He certainly wasn't the sort of secret Catholic that his children would be. But Charles was sympathetic. He had a Catholic wife and close ties to the Bourbons. It was a problem in the Stuart dynasty. And King Charles was moving the Church of England toward high Anglicanism. He built huge, monumental churches that were bedecked in gold and jewels. They had idols overlooking their stone altars, and many Protestants considered that sinful idolatry. And he had the Anglicans receiving communion. Now that's not unheard of today, but in the 1630s it was heresy. Literally, it was heretical to take communion as a Protestant in most sects. Many in England believed that Charles was clandestinely moving the Anglican faith toward something that resembled Catholicism, and he would continue moving it until he could abolish Anglicanism altogether. Now, a lot of people raised their concerns over this, but any noblemen who voiced their concerns had an ear cut off. Any commoners that did so were just killed. But a growing number of Protestants were growing more and more militant. The parliamentarians, those who did not support the king, were arming for war. But then we have the Puritans, kind of a wild card in this whole affair. The Puritans believed in a sort of zealous Christian communism. And, not the kind of cool Tolstoyan Christian anarchism. The Puritans weren't pacifists. The kingdom of God was absolutely not within you. The Puritans, at least those who rose to become the leaders of the movement at the time, were all about the sword. The kingdom of God was not a spiritual kingdom, but a top-down, rigid, unbending theocracy. Now all of these forces were in conflict with one another, but the sides were drawing up for battle. England was not yet at war with itself, but Britain was. All of the other nations that would go on to make up the United Kingdom, Scotland and Wales and parts of Ireland, well, they were all skirmishing and fighting smaller battles. And to make everything worse, continental Europe was currently tearing itself apart in the 30 Years' War. That's the climate in which the people of America, both the Catholics in Maryland and the Protestants in Virginia, and every one of them angry at the king, that's the climate in which they found themselves in the 1630s, pointing guns at one another. That's why, even when word arrived that they were to lay down their arms, no one was willing to do so. Back on the Chesapeake, Captain Thomas Smith of the Kent Island pinnace Longtail set sail on the 5th of April, 1634. He was headed to an Algonquin village on the mainland to engage in some absolutely legal trade with the people there. However, en route to the mainland, Longtail was surprised by 2 ships out of Maryland that stopped Captain Smith and Longtail and demanded to see his license to trade from Lord Baltimore. Captain Smith instead produced licenses and letters from the king and the lords of trade and plantations and the Secretary of State of both England and Scotland, as well as Lord Delaware. All of these documents attested to his rights under the law to engage in trade on the mainland. The captains of those 2 Maryland ships ignored those papers. They claimed that they were forgeries, which they weren't. And then they captured Longtail. They brought her back to St. Mary's. They confiscated her cargo and arrested all of the men. The only man who was allowed to go free was Captain Smith, who was given a canoe and allowed to return home with the news. I mean, look at that. Which of those 2 acts looks like piracy to you? The guy who released the ship and the cargo and the men after a stern talking to, or the guy who ignored the king, who stole the ship and the cargo? It's a rare reversal, where we see the Protestants acting as the victims and the Catholics acting as the pirates. However, if we dig a little bit deeper into this act, it gets a bit more sinister. The captains from Maryland demanded a license from Lord Baltimore, and when presented with letters from the king and the lords of trade and everyone who was important, they ignored it, because he didn't have a license from the Baron Baltimore. It suggests to me that the people of Maryland, or at least those 2 ship captains, had allegiances other than those to king and country, that perhaps superseded king and country. In response to this act of piracy, Kent Island outfitted a sloop which was more powerful than anything else on Maryland's waters at the time. The sloop Cockatrice set off for the water around St. Mary's. They intended retribution for the offense they had just suffered with the capture of Longtail, and Cockatrice found a prize almost immediately, a pinnace out of Maryland, and they engaged. But it was a trap. While Cockatrice and that Maryland pinnace were involved in their skirmish, a running and shooting battle, another Maryland pinnace arrived on the scene. While all of her attention was focused on the first ship out of Maryland, the second came up alongside and boarded the Cockatrice. Both crews drew blades and drew blood. They had a brief, if brutal, fight with many men lying dead and even more wounded. But while they were engaged, the other Maryland pinnace came alongside, boarded cockatrice, and won the day. This was a blow to the people of Kent Island. Cockatrice was supposed to be their ace in the hole, and they just lost it, their second ship in as many battles. This set off a series of small naval skirmishes throughout 1635. Most of them aren't terribly well recorded, but people were dying on all sides. However, despite those two initial setbacks, William Claiborne and Kent Island began to do very well. They did so by starting small. They captured the smallest ships they could find and added them to their fleet. That gave them more guns and more mobility and more manpower. In those battles, they took food and trade goods, which they very much needed and which attracted more and more people to Kent Island. This is the textbook foundation for a pirate haven. I mean, why waste your money trading with the Native Americans when you could just steal the furs from Maryland? Not only do you save your money, you make them spend their money with no profit at all. Plus, you're likely to get tobacco and wine and food and guns and ships, and soon enough, men will be flocking to your port to join your navy. Kent Island was building a pirate fleet. But this has a lot to do with politics as well. The governor in Jamestown, officially the deputy governor under Lord Delaware, was very unpopular. There had been some poor decisions made on his part, and a movement was growing in Jamestown to have him removed. William Claiborne, the Secretary of State, was at the forefront of that movement. He was agitating in the assembly and in the streets. His opinions held weight, and his actions had consequences. His bosses, his investors back in London, had interests in Virginia beyond Kent Island. So they sent an agent to rein William Claiborne in. Pirates on the Chesapeake tells us, quote, "In December 1636, Kent Island was visited by one George Evelyn, a man who had recently acquired a 6th share in Claiborne and Company. At first, the purpose of his visit was anything but suspicious. In February of the following year, however, it was learned that Evelyn had been given power of attorney by Claiborne and command of the Kent Island operation." End quote. Claiborne may have been building a proto-pirate fleet there at Kent Island, but he didn't own the island, or the trading post, or the fleet. He proposed it, he founded it, Kent Island was his baby, but his baby belonged to a bunch of rich investors, and they called the shots. George Evelyn, once his position was revealed, ordered William Claiborne to return to London to answer for his actions. Admittedly, they did look bad. But Claiborne, before leaving, did take action. He established another trading post at Palmer Island at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and in his place he left his top lieutenant, Thomas Smith, not exactly in charge, but continuing his legacy. Then he drafted a bond which would prevent George Evelyn from selling any territory or goods or property that belonged to Kent Island. That was a legally binding agreement that George Evelyn freely signed. Quoting Chaumette, quote, "No sooner were Claiborne's sails over the horizon than Evelyn began to violate the bond into which he had entered." End quote. This was unexpected. Claiborne and Company would not have wanted George Evelyn to sell off any of that territory or property. But Claiborne and Company had been taken for a ride. See, when George Evelyn bought that 6th share in their company, he did so with money that came from the pockets of Baron Baltimore. This was industrial espionage, or, colonial espionage, and Evelyn was a double agent. He was Baltimore's man to the core, and he immediately halted all trading operations on Kent Island. He grounded every ship and even had a few of them disassembled. This prevented the residents from sailing out to earn a profit, but it also prevented them from sailing out to get food. Before long, there was a very real threat of starvation on Kent Island. And as we know, rich, powerful London elites threatening a bunch of sailors with poverty and starvation always goes well for those rich, powerful London elites. Thomas Smith, the man left behind by William Claiborne, and another top agent named John Butler spearheaded the resistance of Kent Island. We're talking militias, mobs raised by those two that manned the fort against Evelyn and sent him packing all the way back to Maryland. We're talking about ship convoys making for the mainland for very much needed supplies. George Evelyn tried twice to retake Kent Island. The winds turned his ships back on the first attempt, and on the second, the Kent Island militia fought him back at the walls of their fort. Evelyn fled back to St. Mary's. And we should keep in mind that all of these forces are tiny. Even by colonial standards, they're small. George Evelyn only had 15 men under his command when he made landfall on Kent Island. The next attempt, made by Leonard Calvert, had double that, but only 30 men, and they were split into two forces. Calvert led one of those forces on the east side of the island, while the other force, led by a man named Cornwallis, landed on the west. They made landfall at night under the cover of darkness, and they moved inland toward two of the largest plantations on the island. Without firing a shot at nearly the same time, those two forces captured John Butler and Thomas Smith, asleep in their beds. Come dawn, both forces of musketeers met at the city square with both of their prisoners in chains. They set up shop, and the people began to filter out and eventually to flood the street. But the musketeers didn't round them up or threaten them. They certainly didn't fire upon them. Instead, standing behind and above his two prisoners, Leonard Calvert addressed the people of Kent Island. He announced that Kent Island was now and forever part of the Maryland colony. However, he offered the people of Kent Island clemency for their rebellion, and he offered them a return to profitable business if they agreed to fall in line behind him. Everyone on Kent Island, aside from the two men in chains, agreed. Now, this wasn't official. People back in England were hesitant to make official declarations about the status of Kent Island, considering their last attempt to bring peace had gone absolutely nowhere. If they were to fight it out, let them fight it out and back the victor. In the end, after they were brought back to St. Mary's, John Butler and Thomas Smith were imprisoned, but John Butler was offered clemency. He agreed to certain provisions, and when George Evelyn returned to Kent Island to take command, John Butler was his number two. That offered a certain sense of consistency to the leadership. Thomas Smith, on the other hand, they had to make an example of. He was charged and tried, found guilty, and convicted on acts of piracy. That was the first such conviction in America. He was sentenced to hang. However, after being shown that they were serious, they offered him clemency as well. All he had to do was support the forces of Evelyn and Maryland. Smith agreed and returned to Kent Island, but fled in his ship and returned almost immediately to rebellion. He was caught shortly thereafter, and in April 1638, Thomas Smith was marched to the St. Mary's gallows and hanged by the neck until dead. That's the first execution for piracy in the English colonies. Thomas Smith and John Butler, while leaders of the rebellion, were small potatoes. William Claiborne was the true leader and the mastermind of everything that had happened on Kent Island. William Claiborne was censured and relieved of duty by his investors for his acts of criminal activity, and then he was charged and tried by Leonard Calvert and the Assembly of Maryland. William Claiborne was found guilty of, quote, grievous crimes of piracy and murder, end quote, on the 24th of March, 1638. He was sentenced to hang. However, Thomas Smith was not in Maryland, he was not in Virginia, and at this point, he was not in England. Thomas Smith was charged and tried and sentenced in absentia. Still, it was a symbolic victory, and the governor of Virginia appealed the decision with the Lords of Trade. However, they ruled against the governor and William Claiborne, and thus Virginia and their assembly accepted the decision and removed William Claiborne from his post as Secretary of State. His lands were absorbed back into Virginia, and Maryland confiscated all of his lands on Kent Island. William Claiborne was out there with a ship somewhere on the seas, and he was now a man with no home, not in England, not in Virginia, not in Maryland, and in the eyes of the law of all three, William Claiborne was an outlaw. And it's always a good idea, when you don't know where a man who has already shown his proclivity and vast talents for grievous crimes of piracy and murder, it's always a good idea to name him outlaw. Somewhere out there, William Claiborne was planning his revenge. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show. Everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us a rating or a review, everybody who has signed up to help the show through the website or PayPal, and everybody who has recommended this show. All of you make this show possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the absolutely fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't yet checked them out, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, Reddit, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.